Film scholars argue about what the most important eras in the history of film have been. And there are a lot of cases to be made for a lot of different periods, but I think that one that everyone would agree on is the period from 1908 to 1920. That dozen or 13 years really characterizes, I think, the biggest changes that we find in filmmaking. So today I want to talk about what those changes are, focusing particularly on the creative choices and artistic changes that took place in the era in terms of how mainstream movies were made. The period 1908 to 1920 is important on many dimensions, one of which is that it's the period when something we'd recognize as the film industry or film business comes into existence. What happens is that the whole international film business starts to consolidate around World War I. That means that certain major firms in Europe were created or revised or even declined at this period in various countries like Denmark and France and Sweden. In America, we get firms becoming created that will later become, very soon in fact, become the core of the Hollywood studio system. And you recognize many of these names, Lowe's, Metro, Fox, Paramount, and so on, are still with us today. It's also a period when the film industry plays host to many vigorous creators, many distinct and individualized artistic talents like Urban God in Denmark, Carmina Gallone in Italy, and others like Foyard and Gantz and Griffith and Sennett, DeMille, Ince, Chaplin, and so on. This is really the period where the big names of silent cinema kind of get started. The same period is when we get what we consider, I think, modern movie theaters. At first, many of those theaters came from legitimate theaters, places where plays and dramas and vaudeville were played out, but then got converted to show movies. And in fact, with the rise of the feature film, the long film, film-going becomes not just a short-term diversion, 30, 45 minutes borrowed from the day, but actually you go out to the movies to see an entire evening's entertainment. Not only are existing legitimate theaters converted at this period, but also purpose-built, dedicated cinemas get built, such as the Gem Theater in Baraboo, Wisconsin, devoted wholly just to showing movies. And as more and more theaters get built, they start to be formed into film chains, various circuits of theaters that extend across the entire United States. And of course, not just in Wisconsin, but also in Cairo, for instance, a very beautiful theater gets built in 1908, and the Palladstheatret in Copenhagen in 1912, which is a reconverted railway station. So the period sees a real flourishing of the purely cinematic exhibition venue, the places where you go to see movies. At the same time, the period sees an emergence of what we recognize very easily, I think, as the same movie culture that we have today. That means things like the rise of film magazines and newspapers and a general fan public. In France, for instance, Ciné Journal, Le Film, Ciné pour tous, and critics and theorists start to emerge like Ricciotto Canuto and Louis Deluc. Same thing in America with Moving Picture World and Photoplay, an early fan magazine. Critics and theorists like Frank Woods, Hugo Münsterberg, and others start to talk about cinema as a distinct medium or art form. Still, many things are the same. The idea of a fan magazine devoted to covering the movies is still very much with us. The actual movies that are shown are recognizably more like ours than the ones in previous years. Artistically, you get distinctive forms and appeals that start to come out. For instance, there are stars like Asta Nielsen, Charlie Chaplin, and so on. There are genres. Virtually all the genres we know today were originated or were exploited more extensively in this period of 1908 to 1920. The detective film, the melodrama, horror, spy films, westerns, and so on, all come into being around this period. The formats that we would recognize also come into play here. The so-called multiple reel film, that is longer than 15 minutes. So films start to become 45 minutes or an hour long or longer, something we would recognize as a so-called feature film. And because they're getting longer, films start to have more complicated plots with several characters and several lines of action that have to be woven together, not the simple, short comedies or little dramas that have been in existence for the previous years. And just as important are two systems of storytelling which come into existence at this period, both of which continue today, and both of which will be my main focus in the rest of this talk. I think just a glance shows you that if you look at cinemas in the 1910s, you see some surprising correspondences with the films that we recognize today. So I show you Face Off and Gun Down in For a Few Dollars More. And we see in a film from 1917, very similar kind of composition, framing, cutting, and so forth. And of course, it's a Western, just as we know from those days. So film style changes in the 1910s. The question is, why? What are the various processes? How do we describe it, and how do we explain it? Well, there's been one school of thought, a very important school of thought, that believes that this was essentially a shift from filming theater to something else, something that was more purely cinematic, something that was more characteristic of movies as movies. So, for instance, the broad performance styles of theatrical performance becomes something subtler, smoother, more indirect and oblique. The same thing with long takes. Camera stands back and films an entire scene, but actually what starts to happen is we get scenes cut up into detail shots, closer views. And that leads people to think about editing as something that you really don't have in the theater, something that you have that's specifically cinematic. Historians that take this position also tend to pick out certain directors as pioneers, directors like Méliès, Porter, Griffith, and the Soviets. They come to be the kind of heroes of the exploration of the intrinsically cinematic qualities, things that are opposite to or different from theater. And this position of the shift from theater to cinematic expression gets articulated by 1920s historians and critics, and really continue right up to the present. I think that this belief that the big change has been dumping theater and moving towards pure cinema is still around us today. It's still part of the popular understanding of how movies changed. And there is some evidence for this. If you pick some examples, you find in a lot of early cinema records of theatrical performances, such as Lumiere's Christ film from 1897. The camera's far back, the entire scene is played out in one take, and it has that distant, framed look of proscenium theater. And if you again take a look at what happens in the years of the period we're looking at, you see that really the most visible change would seem to be editing, and editing of two types. On the one hand, cross-cutting, that is, presenting two or more events taking place at different places, but at the same time. And what you do is cut from one to the other, so that in Birth of a Nation, while Lillian Gish is besieged, tied up there, the Ku Klux Klan is riding to her rescue. And we cut back and forth from Lillian to the Klan, Lillian to the Klan, in alternation, so that we get a sense of an expanded space and a simultaneous time that you really can't capture in the theater. Editing does this in film very easily. The other option is restricting yourself to a single space. Instead of framing it very distantly and theatrically, the argument goes, we go in for details. So the other discovery that's made in this period, 1908 to 1920, is that you can break a single scene up into closer views. And that's what we get in the second example here, also from Birth of a Nation, where Lillian is playing for the little colonel, and we cut into his reaction, and we cut into her singing. So the scene has been analyzed. It's been broken up, again, in a way that could not be done on the theater stage. And then the standard position goes, this historian's explanation model, goes to say this really gets extended in the 1920s by Soviet filmmakers. Soviet filmmakers realize that actually you can push editing even further. So, for instance, here in Battleship Potemkin, where the baby carriage is bouncing down the steps, we suddenly see a Cossack slashing with his sword. And even the slash is broken up into several shots. You can see there that he's got it over his shoulder and he starts to move, and then we cut back to him moving again, and in a closer view as he shouts out. It's as if we don't need to see the baby carriage being slashed by the Cossack in a single sort of framing that we might get in the theater. We put the pieces together and understand that the Cossack is attacking this baby. And then we get a shot of a woman whose eye's been wounded, and she's screaming at us. So then we have to ask, wait a minute, was he slashing at the baby or the woman? Or is he slashing at both? Or is this really just a kind of image of brutality and tyranny in general, given by these very vivid single images that we put together into a general impression of a purge? That sort of abstract quality to editing is pioneered, explored by the Soviet filmmakers of the 20s, and it's something one could never really get on the theater stage. This leads people to think that editing is where it's at. I show you this quotation from Vsevolod Budovkin, another Soviet director, a contemporary of Eisenstein, who concludes that cinema really is radically different from theater because its material is different. Budovkin says, the theatrical producer has always to do only with real processes. There is material. His finely composed and created work, the scene produced and played upon the stage, is equally a real and actual process that takes place in obedience to the laws of real space and real time. But the material of the film director consists not of real processes happening in real space and real time, but of those pieces of celluloid on which these processes have been recorded. This celluloid is entirely subject to the will of the director who edits it. The foundation of film art is editing. That's a good, I think, summary of the core position of the first set of film historians who explore these stylistic changes of the 19-teens. But, as you'd expect, there is another trend of thought and another body of research and another school of historical inquiry that suggests things could be rethought differently. So I point you toward a second historical frame of reference, or historiographic frame of reference, where researchers have proposed a revisionist paradigm, which is developed in the 70s and the 80s. One thing that this generation of historians did was try to break up early cinema into a more precise set of periods. So what's commonly agreed to be so-called primitive cinema, or the cinema of attractions, from 1894 to 1908, is one major period within the larger frame of silent cinema. And that period is characterized by short films with momentary attractions, as they're called, and very skimpy sorts of narratives. Story is secondary in many, many cases to just an amusing or arousing or exciting bit of filmmaking. Then these historians tend to assume we move to a transitional period from 1908 to 1917, where lots of filmmakers are exploring lots of different options. And then from 1917 on, something called classical continuity cinema tends to be the dominant form of filmic storytelling. And instead of finding great single filmmakers to exemplify these changes, these historians of the revisionist school proposed a different way of thinking about how change took place. Instead of pioneers and big names, they tended to look for groups of filmmakers, some of them really not well known to us, and suggested that what was happening was a very broad collective exploration of norms, that many filmmakers trying all these things in different ways. And for some of these people, someone like D.W. Griffith turns out to be kind of atypical of what was going on more broadly. And as you'd expect, this school has many different interpretations in a finer grain and more detail than I can go into here. So Noel Birch, Barry Salt, Ben Brewster, and Leah Jacobs, Tom Gunning, Kristen Thompson, Charlie Kyle, and so forth have nuanced and refined this very broad sketch that I've just made. But you can see, I think, with a quick example, how interesting this approach could be by looking, for instance, at a scene from The Loafer from 1911, where we see something that looks very modern, a man harnessing up the buckboard, another man comes to him, and then after in a conversation leaves the shot, we cut to the other man somewhere else, hollering back at him, and then a closer view of the man at the buckboard reacting. This looks very modern to us. And it's not a famous film like The Birth of a Nation, but it's a film that seems to suggest that things are sort of locked in place for what would later become very standard filmmaking practice. Moreover, this school of revisionist historians suggests we shouldn't talk just about editing in general, that theatrical cinema was replaced by editing-based cinema, but rather one form of editing, one type or trend of editing. And that's been called, for want of a better term, continuity editing. And when it's about particular scenes and particular places, as those patterns are worked out in shots, classical scene analysis. One of the things the revisionist historians did that their predecessors had not done was to try some very close analyses of scenes, going shot by shot, and try to figure out the premises or logic behind the editing patterns they found in films of this period. And of course, they charted the deviations from it, the things that didn't seem to match up. In order to do those kinds of close analyses, the historians also drew on a much wider database, we might say, a wider array of ordinary films, not confining themselves to the masterpieces that had been handed down by received opinion, but actually looking at films that also seemed to have interesting patterns of editing construction that were not so well known, like The Clodhopper from 1917. And again, if you look at the way the scene goes, the way the shots flow, master shot, shot of the boy with the wash basin by the sink, shot of mom looking at him, and the camera's gone around kind of the other side of the table to show her. Again, it looks very modern. We might then ask what characterizes this editing-driven approach. Well, the revisionist historians I'm mentioning went into a lot of detail about this and explored it in a lot of ways, and that's what I'll spend a few minutes doing at this point. For one thing, most basically, and this is no news, editing was used to link scenes. You have a scene in one place, it plays itself out, it ends, cut to the next scene, the next place. That's pretty basic. It's editing at a very minimal level. But within scenes, one of the commonest ways of cutting is so-called contiguity cutting. That is, the editing will link adjacent spaces as characters move across them. So, for instance, in Max reprend la liberté, Max goes out of the dining room with a tray full of dishes, and he goes into the kitchen. We understand that the two spaces must be pretty close because he simply goes out, the doors close, he comes in another place. This, again, is pretty basic, but it already suggests that editing is being used to follow the flow of the story. And we find that there are privileged locales for editing, for particular filming situations. So, for instance, in these scenes from Fantomas by Louis Fayard, we see that the interior can be played out in a single shot, what the first tradition would consider very theatrical. But that once the characters get outside, once the actors and the directors and crew are outside, we suddenly get a lot of different angles. So in a later scene, in the shootout, among these barrels, we get several different angles on the gun battle. Another privileged locale is a theater or a courtroom, where people tend to be spaced out at quite a distance from each other. So that seems to motivate filmmakers to cut the scene up quite a bit. And I give you an example of this from Roman de Mousse by Léonce Perret, where we have long shots of the courtroom, but then closer views of the judges, of the witnesses, of the audience, and even shots of single characters. So clearly, there was no way to handle this scene in a single extensive shot because everything would just be too small. Once we have something more intimate, we have interiors with a few characters. The standard method at this period was what was called the scene plus the insert. That is, we have a master shot or overall framing that shows all the relevant space, and then we cut in some detail that's important. And very often that detail was just a piece of printed matter. Someone's reading a letter or a telegram, or in this case, a newspaper, and we cut in so that we can see what that is. And then we cut back to the master shot. The scene plus the insert method is almost the most common method, it seems, of breaking up a scene space. The insert can also be a point of view more directly. In a way, the letter or the newspaper is a kind of point of view, but here this is really marked as such. So, for instance, when Inspector Jouve looks into the hat and sees the telltale insignia, we get a point of view shot of him doing that, and then return to the so-called master scene. Now, many inserts that aren't written matter or point of view shots tend to be of another sort. Those cuts tend to be along the axis of the camera lens, and so they're called axial cuts. The characters are arrayed perpendicular to the camera, the set is in the background behind them, and the camera position is a cut into a new and closer view. So along the axis of the camera lens, sort of straight in or straight back. That can be used, of course, to emphasize not just a character point of view, but a detail that we need to see. So in the express train mystery, we have our master scene, and then we cut in directly so that we can see the enlarged view of the telltale scratches that are on the revolver. Those just wouldn't be visible in the overall shot. Treating the camera axis as the central organizing space of the scene is pretty commonsensical. The axial cut then is a pretty obvious kind of device, and it's probably one of the reasons that it comes in rather early. But I think what happens is that in the course of the teens, the period we're looking at, we actually start to see filmmakers start to rethink that and think about another way to consider the geometry of the scene's space. Instead of organizing the action around the camera axis, they start to think about organizing the action in a new way, a new kind of geometry, a way of thinking about the characters' relationships as dominant, so that the axis of action is really that between the characters rather than the camera and the characters. And that gives us something that's more like what we would think of now as a master shot rather than the scene plus insert approach that we saw earlier. So that the camera can still be quite far back and frame the whole action. But once we grant that the primary connection is the one between the characters, we can put the camera at lots of different angles to the action. It can be closer, further, farther back, whatever, as long as it kind of retains a clarity about how those characters are aligned with respect to one another. We can see this pretty clearly in a scene from Edward Sloman's The Masked Heart from 1917. And one of the things this example shows, I think, is how important the eye line is to sustaining that idea that the relationship between the characters is all important. So in the beginning of the scene, we have a master shot that shows all the characters more or less lined up in a straight line, as one fairly boring guy is reading aloud to the two women and the other man, our protagonist. And immediately we get a scene breakdown, an analytical editing approach that shows first him sort of grumpily watching, and then the woman that he's interested in reacting by simply seeming entranced by the reading of the other man. It's the eye lines that tell us where they are and reinforces our sense of our protagonist being on the left and the young woman on the right. Then we cut back to a closer view, actually, of our protagonist sort of reacting gloomily. And then we start to get the inserts of the other characters, the man reading, the woman's mother reacting to him, and again, the eye lines are completely consistent, back to the man reading, back to our protagonist who's completely put off by this, back to a master shot that reorients us, and then back to another shot of the young woman reacting with pleasure. And the final frame I show you is the one of our protagonist leaving. So what we've had is a very straightforward, by today's standards, analysis of the action with the what we'd now call the axis of action or 180-degree line being kept consistent, and we simply cut into closer views of these characters. But what keeps us oriented is partly the angle of their bodies, of course, and the fact that they're not shown as getting up and moving around, but also the eye lines, the fact that people are looking at one another. It keeps us all very well oriented, and it reinforces the sense that the key sort of geometry of the scene will be found between the characters rather than between the characters and the camera. Of course, once you've started to emphasize the relationship between the characters, you can also angle your actors a little bit to play that up so that staging gets modified in the course of this realization that the important geometry is between the two or more characters. And that allows the camera to come in a little closer and angle itself even more flexibly. To give an example, here's an instance from The Return of Draw Egan, a William S. Hart film, that begins with Hart standing there, looking off, and we can already see that he's angled quite a bit in relationship to the set, because you can see that back wall going off at a diagonal behind him. Then we get the shot of a woman looking at him, and that's more frontal of her for sure, but her face is angled a bit as she turns to look. Then back to him. Again, analysis is proceeding. We're getting a closer view, so we really understand that he's looking at her. And the eye lines are key here, of course. And then her eye line reinforcing that. So they're definitely looking at each other along an axis of action. And then a slightly further back framing of him that allows space for the two older men to come in and her father to signal, come over and meet this man. And she leaves the framing that we saw her in, and then comes into what we'd now consider a full-fledged master shot. So this axis of action principle with the actors tipped a bit or swiveled a bit toward one another, and letting the camera really get in between them, also allows us to imagine a space between them that we don't have to see in its totality. We don't get the master shot until the very end of the scene, but we've already understood where they are in relationship to each other. Now the 180-degree line, the idea that the key geometry is between the characters, can be pushed a bit, as it is in this scene. You can get the line to be more aligned in depth. So here, for instance, in The Woman in White, an adaptation of Wilkie Collins' great novel, you see a scene where the husband and Count Fosco are plotting against the husband's wife, and Fosco, being suspicious, goes to the doorway in the back. So in that opening frame I show you, the axis of action is really going into depth. It goes from the husband in the right foreground into the depth with Fosco in the center. Then we cut in directly, pretty much of an axial cut, to show him opening the door and revealing Marion. But what's striking about this scene is that then the next shot goes around to the other side of the husband. We see him from the front, even though he'd been seen from the back in the first framing, and it's perfectly okay because we're still obeying that axis that runs from the husband and now all the way to Marion. And that idea is reinforced by the next framing where the door opens fully and we see Marion looking at Fosco and who's being watched by the husband. So again, the axis is still there. We've cut around among it, and the key geometry is that connects the different characters. But as I said earlier, this is a period of exploration, and so sometimes the axis of action is treated pretty flexibly. It doesn't mean that it's unintelligible. We can still follow what's going on, but I think it's fair to say that in this period, a lot of directors are playing around a little bit or exploring how far you can push this idea of the axis of action. Can you expand the space in ways that are still intelligible but may not obey a strict single line between the characters? Take this scene from Hearts and Diamonds, a little comedy from 1914. You've got two couples, one in the foreground playing a guitar and singing, one in the background, you can see on the right there. They're sitting at a settee, sort of at right angles to the couple in the foreground. What happens is that we see the boy in the second couple pick up a pillow, and we're now behind that couple we saw in the foreground, the ones making the music, as he picks up the pillow and throws it. Then we cut back to the master framing we've had before that shows the pillow flying through the air. And in the fourth frame, we see the young woman reacting. She sort of lets out a whoop and jumps up. Well, then what happens is we get a shot that shows the rear of them as she jumps up, a kind of match on action, but from the other side of that couple as she hops up. And then another pillow in that sixth frame, a pillow comes flying in and hits her. And then we cut back to the couple we've seen before, the other couple on the settee, as the boy prepares to throw yet another pillow, a third pillow. So we've been pretty flexibly moved around this space. The initial framing didn't provide a very clear-cut axis of action, and we sort of had to figure out a little bit where we are. But because the action is so clear and we understand where everybody is, it isn't so difficult to make out. It isn't really confusing, I think. But it is not exactly the way you might have staged it if you'd staged a sort of linear line of the couple, say, the music-making couple on the left-hand side of the frame and the other boy and the other girl on the right-hand side of the frame, and they just started doing it back and forth. This is a little more ambitious, I guess you'd say, the way of setting up the scene. The next example I'm going to show you is ambitious too, I think, because it suggests that you can play pretty fast and loose with the axis of action. Again, it's a period when people are exploring things, and probably later they wouldn't have handled this in quite the same way. But it's an instructive example to show, I think, that the basic ideas of scene analysis, and particularly continuity analysis, are already there. Not every film will use all of them, but for most American filmmakers and many European filmmakers, they're ready to be used. The scene is from a movie called His Mother's Boy, Victor Schertzinger film from 1917, and I'm going to show it to you in two parts. The scene begins with creditors assembled around a widow and her son. The father has died, leaving a lot of debts, including what is apparently a worthless mine in the West. So the creditors are assembled, and we see the son kneeling by the mother. The next shot we cut is to the other side of them. They're flipped around, so to speak, so that we see the son on the right and the mother on the left, with the doorway in the background there and the table in the foreground. But we still understand that because we've had a master shot where they're pretty salient, pretty obviously there in that middle of that frame. So then in the third frame, the son gets up, and in a smooth match on action, he rises to confront the creditors. That's in the fourth and the fifth frames I show you. We then cut in a kind of 90-degree position to show him looking at the creditors with a new wall behind him. So we've kind of penetrated the space and gone around, somewhat to the extent we did in Hearts and Diamonds. But then we see the mother looking apprehensively up at him like, don't make so much trouble. And then the creditors leave. So we have a kind of master shot that replaces him and the mother within the larger space, repositions them so we know where we are. Again, by today's standards, perhaps people wouldn't have shown the mother from quite that angle. But again, it's quite comprehensible. That's the first phase of the scene. In the second phase, and I start with the same frame I've already showed you at the end of the first phase, they're side by side, And he starts to examine, the son starts to examine that deed I mentioned to the mind. And then we get another 90-degree cut, seeing that same doorway with the curtains behind them as he starts to examine it. And then we cut in still closer to him, sort of an axial cut, as he speaks to the mother. And the mother looks at him, and here I think we would say that today that would be considered a mistake. She should be looking off to the right rather than off to the left. But again, it's pretty comprehensible. And in a way, it's justified because we go back to the son, and he's kind of looking in a way that kind of echoes the way she looked at him. Anyway, we go back to a master framing of the two, further back than we'd seen before, with the same doorway and the curtains in the background. But what's striking here, I think, is what's gone. The table's gone. The chair the lady was sitting in is gone. All those things are completely vanished. And that we don't notice that, I think, is the power of this sort of cutting-oriented approach to continuity. He seems to be taking a very decisive step. The mother pats him on the shoulder in that closer view we see, and she then, in the same framing, passes out of the shot, close to the camera. Cut to her entering an adjacent space, very close, because he's still in the frame too, near the window there. She goes near the window. He turns her around as he swivels around and stops her. And then we get the title, There's No Use Arguing, I'm Going. And the scene ends on a medium close-up of him. So we've had a very dynamic penetration of the space. We've seen the space from lots of different angles. We've seen the characters from lots of different angles and different distances. Each one is timed to emphasize a certain dramatic point at each moment. In fact, there are 14 shots here. Nearly all of those shots are from different camera positions. Very few times is a setup repeated. And this is only one example. There are many 1917 films from both America and Europe that show that the premises of classical scene analysis as we now understand them are already available and quite intricate, in some ways more intricate than we find today. We find more freedom in a way of exploring the space than we find in a lot of films we'd see today. Not every film will use all of them, as I say here, but they're now dominant for most American and some European filmmakers. And they continue. They're part of the heritage of international filmmaking. During the 1920s, classical scene analysis gives you the basic schemas for filmmaking in a lot of different countries. I give you an example from the Japanese film Cuckoo from 1922, where you can see we have our establishing shot, the family is gathered around the sickbed, and then different shots move around the sickbed, showing different characters reacting to what's going on in the scene, with angled insert shots and angled closer views. And in fact, you can argue that continuity cinema, with its axis of action and the principles of moving the camera, positioning the camera in different points in space, is really the basis for most later innovations. Take technology, camera movement, color, widescreen, 3D. All these things work within that framework. If you're going to have widescreen cinema, you still have to obey the continuity system. And as we see today, 3D cinema obeys the continuity system. It's most apparent maybe with the coming of sound, because what happens with the coming of sound in the very early years is that filmmakers are so concerned to preserve those options of the continuity system that they use multiple cameras to make sure they can have different angles to cut together. You get something like this, which of course is continuing to this day in 3-camera and 4-camera television. And it becomes a framework for innovations in another way. A lot of the schools and movements and avant-garde trends that we find that follow tend to take continuity editing as their basis. They're the sort of ground on which they can develop their own innovations. So the 1920s avant-gardes in Germany and France and elsewhere, the Soviet montage cinema of the 20s, neorealism of the 40s, new waves, young cinema since the 50s, they've all sort of accepted provisionally the continuity system, even if they're going to play with it, tweak it, and revise it in various fashions. Take this scene from Muriel, where Alphonse is sitting on the sofa there. He lights a cigar in that upper shot. And then we cut to a closer view of him, puffing away at it. But then suddenly, he extinguishes it. And we realize that actually René has played a trick on us. His movement of moving his hand to the cigar in the first frame that seems to be continued in the second frame isn't really the same movement. That's when he's starting to smoke. What he's done, René has done, is to skip over a lot of time, the amount of time it takes Alphonse to smoke his cigar, and not let us see that. We tend to think it's continuous time, but actually it's been, he's used an ellipsis, a gap, to cover a period of time, and we didn't notice it. It was kind of, we were misled. But of course, still later trends, such as today's trend toward what I've called intensified continuity, faster cutting, lots of close-ups, rapid camera movements, also tend to work within the continuity framework. So even though the shots are closer, the shots are shorter, the camera movements are fast and even blurry sometimes, continuity still is the basis of what's going on, for the most part. And in fact, we know that continuity is a kind of system or a standard system because there are many books about it. At this point, it's like an academic system, like teaching painters perspective drawing. Just you can go to the store and buy a book on how to draw in perspective. You can go to the store and buy a book on how to shoot continuity cinema. So we've looked at two trends, an explanation of what's going on in this period with respect to film style between 1908 and 1920. The first, which says theater replaced by editing. The second says, actually, it was more complicated with some transitional things, and not just editing in general, but a specific kind of editing. There's a third family of explanations that I want to rehearse with you in the time remaining. And that cuts things up a little differently. It leaves the cinema of attractions aside for the most part and says, let's just focus on that period 1908 to 1920, the one that I've picked out to look at today. And instead of seeing something replaced by something else, theater replaced by cutting, let's say, we find two tendencies more or less simultaneous. The first, what can be called tableau cinema, which is chiefly of the 1910s, is staging-based. It depends on moving people around the frame. And it's largely, though by no means wholly, European. The second trend is continuity cinema. From the 1910s, and as we've seen, it continues right up till today. That's editing-driven rather than staging-driven, and it's largely American, though of course there are exceptions. Who made it happen? Again, groups, collective discoveries. Again, things become normative, normalized, standardized. And we find many traditions within that trend. And again, if you want to burrow deeper, you can look at different interpretations of it. Yuri Tsivian, again, Leah Jacobs, Ben Brewster, Kristen Thompson, and me to some extent as well. But let's look at what this position entails. The key, I think, is to see tableau cinema as a distinct aesthetic tradition of the 1910s. It's just as important and just as interesting to us today as the development of editing that we've just looked at. Now, in some respects, it's not very theatrical. It's indebted to painting. And someone like Yuri Tsivian will point to pictorial directors, like the great Russian director Yevgeny Bauer, and say, look at an image like this, it looks like a painting. But yet in other respects, this tableau tradition is deeply theatrical. Take, for instance, the Italian diva films, which Ben Brewster and Leah Jacobs have worked a lot on. They'll point to those and say, this is really operatic. This really owes a lot, at least in the performance styles, to stage performance. Myself, I like to compromise on this. I think we can call it what Jean Mitry called it, painterly theatricality. There is a theatrical dimension, but as it were, filtered through certain traditions of painting. Whatever we call it, I want to argue that the tableau filmmakers developed a distinctive visual approach, and they thought that was as specifically cinematic as later people, like Podovkin, thought editing was. In other words, the tableau cinema is itself specific to cinema. Theatrical though it may look, it's actually not all that theatrical in certain respects. Why? Because cinema is a method of optical projection. Let me show you an example. This is a film from 1909, so it's early in the period we're looking at, a Danish film called Pat Corner. And if you look at the first frame, you might say, man, that's completely theatrical, because look, you've got a crypt with a guard and a guy on the other side of that wall trying to dig it underneath the wall to get into the crypt, and the guard hears the noise. But look how artificial it is. The wall just stops. You see it just breaks there. If in reality that wall goes on indefinitely. Otherwise, the man who's digging it would just come around the side of the wall. But this is a theatrical convention, the so-called fourth wall, that says, look, we just have to pretend that a wall has been lifted away and we're watching what's going on inside a room. In this case, sort of a bigger space than a room. But nevertheless, the idea is it's a theatrical convention. We just take it for granted that the man couldn't walk around the edge of the set. Fair enough, theatrical. But later in the film, in fact, in the end scene of the film, what we get is something rather strange. Pat has solved the mystery, and there he is standing in the middle of the frame, and his client comes in to congratulate him. And standing in the background, sort of a third of the way on the right of the frame, is a clerk. Well, when Pat and the client meet in the center of the frame, they shake hands. And it turns out that the client blocks the clerk. You can't really see him. And then the clerk takes a step backwards so that we can see him. He moves himself deliberately into a line of visibility. And then Pat steps forward again, blocking the clerk. You can't see him anymore. But the clerk is not, the actor, I should say, playing the clerk, is not to be gainsaid, because he then slides himself over a little bit so we can see him again between the two men. He moved off to his right, and then he moved off to his left. Now, the point I want to make is that this guy is struggling to be seen by us. Fair enough, he's a scene stealer, but it wouldn't work on the stage. It couldn't be done on the stage because since there are so many different people sitting at different places in the auditorium, so many people angled with different sight lines watching the stage, that he would be blocked at one point or another for almost everybody. He would be visible for some people in, say, that third frame, people sitting off on the left, and then he would be no longer visible to others on the right when he stepped into the center. In other words, this kind of blocking and revealing wouldn't work on the stage because there are so many different sight lines of people sitting at so many different angles to the action. You can see this manipulated or actually used by filmmakers in a film like Fantomas, a very simple kind of basic lesson in this. The beginning of the scene takes place in this cafe. The violinist is strumming away and Josephine is listening. And the violinist is right in the center of the frame. You can see him there along that aisle. He's not an important character. He's just holding the center of the frame. He walks out frame right. And in the background there, you can see that Jouve and Fandor are coming in, a very distant, that perspective. He's been holding that spot, as it were, available for them, and he clears away. So then we get to see him as see Jouve and Fandor as he walks off. They come to the foreground and sit in the fourth frame we have there, looking off at Josephine. So in other words, here's a case where that blocking and revealing was not an accident, but was done very calculatedly to attract our attention to a certain zone, clear it, and let the main actors come in and be seen clearly. And why is that? Well, because in most Western theaters, in the Western theatrical tradition, horizontal staging is the norm. That is, stages tend to be rather shallow, but rather wide. And I show you some examples from history that show you how that works. That allows people to be spaced out across the stage floor, and then people from lots of different angles in the audience, like say in the Elizabethan theater, the wooden O, can see the actors pretty clearly. So lateral staging is the norm, and you can see that again in other examples from other Western theater. Now, it isn't true of all kinds of theater that we have. It isn't true of, say, theater in the round necessarily. It isn't true of Japanese theater. It isn't true of processional theater like Mardi Gras. But this is tied to proscenium theater. Nevertheless, lateral staging in a fairly shallow playing space is the dominant conception of theatrical space in the mainstream tradition I'm talking about. But cinema's completely different because the camera lens picks up the rays of light and focuses them on a single point. What's visible to the camera isn't a wide, shallow space. It's a narrow, deep space. In fact, it has the shape of a pyramid, a tipped-over pyramid. We should technically say a trapezoid because that so-called front line cuts off the tip of the pyramid. You can't focus the lens on itself. So basically, you've got some zone in there that's not going to be in focus, so we just say, okay, that's just chopped off. So it's a kind of a pyramid with a little bit chopped off. But you see my point is that this playing space is not as much deeper, but also much narrower in the front, widening to the back indefinitely. That's because of the way lenses and light work. You just can't get around it. Here's an overhead view from a book of the period, from a 1913 book, that shows that people were very aware of this, the so-called filmic or cinematic stage, as it was called, where it's very different from the theatrical stage. And you can see that tapering, again, triangle in this case, that goes right to the lens. That's the playing space. And what the lens sees is what matters. So we're not in theater anymore. In theater, you have to arrange people so that lots of members of the audience can see them. In cinema, the trick is to arrange them in relationship to only one eye, the eye of the camera. And that eye takes in a triangle, not a rectangle. And in fact, you see some of this in 1910's tableau cinema. You see it as a painterly space. If you look at Repin's painting, They Did Not Expect Him, you get that same tunnel vision effect of like things very close to the camera looming large and getting smaller and smaller as they go back, but along that sort of funnel shape. And indeed, many directors of the period, like Alfred Machen in the Black Diamond, Le Diamant Noir, even imitates that kind of composition where things get stacked up and gradually dwindle into the distance. And people start to use that expressively so that you can create two planes of action, a drama in the foreground and then someone coming in these two scenes from Holger Madsen's Life of an Evangelist. Something happens in the foreground, but then the distance where the angle of coverage widens can be used for a dramatic entrance. So how do you call people's attention to what's important in the scene? If it's taking on so much and going back so far, how do you make sure the audience watches what's important? Well, directors developed a lot of different strategies. Remember, this is all being done without editing. Single take scenes, moving the actors around the frame. One of the obvious ways to catch the audience's eye is through centering. We know that all other things being equal, people will look at the center of the picture format. So that's what they do. They will have actors move to and from the center of the frame, as in this Danish film by August Blom, where the father, complaining about his son, steps into the center of the frame in that second frame I give you, then steps away. But again, it's a blocking revealing strategy because when he turns around to keep talking to the mother, he doesn't go into the center. He's opened up that kind of sieve or tunnel that lets us see the butler, that's in the fourth frame, come into the background, and then the son finally come in the fifth frame in the background, and the scene continues. But our eyes have been kept in that central zone by the father's movement and then the vista that he reveals. Frontality helps too. So for instance, in this scene, from a German film of 1912, you have the officers roistering around and having a good time, all pretty frontal to us. But when their commanding officer comes in that second frame, they immediately stand up and pivot away from us so that we see only their backs. But the officer's face is still visible, again, in the center of the frame, but frontal. He's really the only thing you can watch to get any information. So his face is hovering right there in the center of the frame. What else calls attention to areas of the shot? Well, movements of any sort, even slight movements. In this scene from Roberto Roberti's film, we have the woman who's confronting her errant lover, and she is going to pull a knife from her shawl. But just as she pulls that knife, she swivels around, and that gesture opens up a little space in the background, and the butler runs in. So my argument is that we would start to notice her, we'd be paying attention to her in that area of the shot when she moves, and the butler sort of catches that movement and continues it, and he comes to the center of the frame and frontal. So that movement will attract our attention, and it can be an interplay with all these other factors like centering and frontality. Now, movement to the foreground is a very powerful attention getter, and we can go back into very early cinema and see how that works. I show you some scenes from earlier films where, as people move closer to the center, they become larger, they become more frontal, and we get to see the action more clearly. So this is an old option, but it gets used with great refinement in films of this period, 1908 to 1920. Take this scene, The White Slave Trade 2 by August Blom, where it's a brothel, and a woman who's just joined the brothel comes in that first frame. In the center of the frame, she comes through the doorway, and the men start to look at her. She then zigzags and sits down in the right corner of the shot. That's my second frame there. and the men start to cluster around her, and then two more men show up, and they come forward to the front plane again to comment on her and watch. And her pimp is, in fact, about to try to sell her to somebody. So there's a whole zigzag dynamic developed of diagonals, people coming in and then going slightly right or slightly left, but again, using that movement to the foreground. Another way to attract attention is with what we might call aperture framing. That is, the camera may be fairly far back, but we'll tend to pay attention to things that are framed within windows or doorways or some other kind of rectangular shape. This happens in another Danish film, Life of the Evangelist, where the thugs in the tavern at the table are trying to persuade the boy to go in with them on a heist. And as he's trying to decide, he's rather weak-willed, as you can tell, his girlfriend appears in the top step that leads down to the tavern, and we see her in the window on the street outside. It really calls attention to her. She's frontal again, she's quite centered, and of course she's moved to that position. So our eye goes to her, realizing that she has a chance now to try to block him from joining the gang. A very handy sort of aperture is mirrors. Mirrors are frequently used in films of this period to create very complex compositions and to tell the story in kind of oblique and indirect ways. Take this scene from the amazing film The Ballet Dancer by August Blom, 1911. Asta Nielsen plays a woman who's both a ballet dancer and a singer. And we see in the first frame, up above in the upper left corner, her hostess, who's invited her to sing for the society soiree, kind of leading her into this composition, very dense composition. The hostess leaves, goes out the frame right, and then in the next frame I show you, Asta takes that little stage that's there, and hostess's husband kind of introduces her. And you notice that behind her, there is a mirror standing right by her head there. She turns around, she's about to sing. Everyone's gathered and the husband has taken his seat. But she looks off right. And what she sees is reflected in the mirror there by her head, which is what she sees is her boyfriend kissing the neck of the hostess. So they're having an affair right under the nose of the husband, in effect. And Asta's completely aghast at this. And then in that fourth frame I've shown you, the lower right, she stops singing, she extends her hand and points to them accusingly. And what's a killer about this is that as she points, her finger is pointing directly to him, the bad boyfriend, in the mirror, reflected in the mirror. So it's as if she is indicating to us, look, if you didn't see him before, here's what I'm seeing that's putting me off. This guy is playing around with this other woman. But it's all done in a very concise, compact way with this sort of flourish of that finger that's directing us exactly what to see in the aperture of the mirror. Here's another example, a funnier example, from an Ernst Lubitsch film. He didn't direct it. He's a star of this movie. What happens is he's a kind of a clerk trying to rise in this the department store. The master of the firm is what it's called. And he is summoned into this little area behind a curtain by the boss's wife. She's taken a shine to Ernst and wants to flirt with him a while. So she brings him to the rear there. And it turns out that once you get inside, you can see that there's a mirror behind her in that wall there. And in fact, you could see it in that earlier shot when she's peering around the curtain. But now it's quite distinct. You can see the two of them reflected in the mirror as she starts to play around with him. But then they turn, and we can see why they turn, because we see between them in that third frame, the husband looking right at them. He's come in behind that curtain, and he's staring at them, and we see his face reflected in the mirror. He bears down on them, moves into the frame, starts to holler at the wife, and then bears down on Ernst and circles around so Ernst trades places with him. He pivots one way and Ernst goes the other way, so he's glaring at him. But then he sort of gives up and says, okay, actually, I don't care. Go do what you want. Ernst is now shrinking into the corner of the frame. The husband stalks out, and he even turns at the doorway and laughs at them. And we see that reflected in the mirror. And we see Ernst in the lower right corner there, completely cowering in the shadow behind the wife. And then she moves aside so that we can see Ernst a little more clearly, and he stands up and says, why me? Leave me alone. Again, kind of switching around their positions that we saw in the beginning, but again, returning to this more stable situation. The mirror has served as a kind of announcement of the husband coming in and our notification of when he walked out. It's sometimes useful to think about common problems that run through filmmaking traditions. How do you handle this or that kind of situation? And one of the classic situations is a dinner table. How do you shoot or cut, if you like, people sitting around a dinner table? Well, in early cinema, this was kind of a problem. And one very early solution was simply stretch people out as if they're sitting on bleachers. This Edison film, racist film about African Americans eating watermelons, takes the problem that way. Just stretch them out horizontally, as if they were watching a sporting event. Another option, which Griffith follows in A Corner in Wheat, is to use that tableau depth, but actually really concentrate on only one figure, in this case the Wheat King, the guy who's seated in the right foreground. He's the most important character, and what happens in the background is not very consequential. People hoist a toast to him, but otherwise there's no big dramatic action taking place there. Another option is to have a more diagonal setup, using characters stretched out a little bit into depth, but still a kind of Last Supper arrangement. And this from a very beautiful film about the life of Jesus called From the Manger to the Cross. But really, most people in most situations, at least in a middle-class household of the period, sit with two people opposite each other on sides of a table, around a table. So this situation would seem to be the problem. And if you're in a tableau situation, how do you handle this? How do you handle the blocking factor that the person opposite somebody in the distance will conceal them and the person in the foreground will be turned completely away from us? Well, editing helps you. If you decide not to use the tableau solution, but go with the editing-driven tradition, the camera can get in between the characters, obviously. And that's something we find, again, early in the history of cinema. Around 1917, it seems, people start to solve this problem. And so we have a master shot of the family sitting down to dinner with the suitor to the daughter of the household. And we cut into the suitor. He's on the opposite side of the table. And to the girl looking at him, that makes sense. And then the mother noticing that they are sharing a kind of loving exchange. And then the father noticing that the mother notices and approves. And then the kids, kind of as a little gag, are just sort of staring in disbelief at all this. But you go into the table and around, you're cutting to different points on the table from within the charmed circle of the situation, the family gathered around the table. And it seems to be very clear. Eye lines are not perfect by today's standards, I suppose, but still everything that's going on is quite clear. So what does the tableau tradition have to offer with respect to the dinner table conundrum? Well, here's a film that tries to tackle it. I've already shown you this frame where the foreground figure blocks the background figure. So we really don't seem to have a very informative scene. But actually, our attention can be guided in a more dynamic way. Because before that, the maid plays an important role. She gets people to pivot and turn around so that we can see them more visibly. That in the case of here, the rogue, the guy who's married to the older woman on the right, can be seen when he stretches out to take something from the platter. The doctor in the foreground and his wife are the other two characters here, and we'll see how they enter the drama. So what happens is after the maid has departed, or as she's leaving, two couples pair off. The doctor in the foreground talks to the wife of the protagonist, the kind of rake, whereas the rake turns to talk to the wife, the doctor's wife. We can see pretty visibly that the center of the scene is the rake and his attention to the young woman. He's obviously looking to score here. And even when the doctor turns his head back up, the rake has still kind of got his head stretched out, so we can still see him trying to charm the young woman. What happens is that the maid kind of turns, and the rogue turns his head and lifts it as if the phone had rung. Indeed, that's what it is. We're getting a cue for a sound effect in a silent movie. And as he turns his head to talk to the maid, he wiggles his finger there. You can see it just over the left shoulder of the doctor. He wiggles his finger, and the maid, as if to say, go answer it. And that becomes a kind of little gesture that signals to us, okay, he's sending the maid off to answer the call. She returns and says, doctor, it's for you. And here's the one chance this poor guy gets to act. He stands up and shrugs his shoulders, extends his arms, and says, as if to say, well, this is what doctors do. Their lives are constantly interrupted by these sorts of things. So he stands up and leaves to take the call, And as he leaves, we can now very clearly see the rogue and the doctor's wife getting their heads together and talking. So in a way, the dinner table problem has been solved by the same kind of slight shifts, blocking and revealing, that we've seen that's ingredient to the tableau tradition from the start. The height of this kind of staging can be seen, I think, in a film by Victor Sjöström, Ingeborg Holm from 1913. I've written about this, and you can follow it on both. I've discussed it both on our blog and in a book. So on the history of film style, so you can actually track this more carefully. But let me just point out to you the situation. Ingeborg has lost her home. Her husband has died, and she's lost his business. So she's been put in the poorhouse. So what happens is, in order to pay her way, she has to board out her two children, a boy and a girl. And the scene that we see here is her having the children come into the office of the superintendent and be taken away by their foster mothers. So what Sjöström does is stage it all in one shot in a very intricate but delicate way, in a way that uses the techniques we've been looking at with a great deal of finesse. So the first phase, she's basically planted the son right in front of the doctor, the superintendent. You can't see his face. The boy just stands there like a fire plug. And she embraces her daughter. You see that in the upper left frame. And just as she buries her face in her daughter's shoulder, you see that in the second frame, in comes the foster mother. And as if to kind of protect or shield the daughter, Ingeborg steps aside a little bit so that we can see in that third frame in the mother coming in and talking to the doctor. Then Ingeborg is even pushed a little bit further aside to the left, and the mother is now very centered, very frontal. She comes forward with welcoming arms to the daughter. They aren't villains, these mothers. And then she takes the girl away. And Ingeborg is sort of pivoted around so to allow space for us to see the daughter and the mother give a final farewell to her. And she has her back to us. So she's acting with her back. That's phase one. Phase two, he just does it all over again. We've got the boy in front of the superintendent, and this time Ingeborg embraces the boy right there, blocking, so we're not distracted by seeing the superintendent. At the same moment, the guard comes in and introduces the next mother. Ingeborg is hugging the son, and the door opens, and we see the mother in the background. Ingeborg then kind of weaves the son over even more to the left of the frame as she turns and watches the new mother come and talk to the superintendent and fill out the papers, where she comes forward very much as had happened before and takes the boy. And in an echo of the end of the first cycle, she goes off frame left as Ingeborg swings a little bit more to the center, and she's even more slumped over. Her, again, acting with her back, but her dejection is even more palpable. So this is really choreography with these very slight movements, turning from the camera, turning back to the camera, pivoting people away to reveal tiny slices of space in the background, then filling those up, doing all this kind of intricate staging, like a choreographed dance, to make sure we see at each instant what's the most important element of the drama. And of course, then to respond to it, to respond emotionally to what we see. The tableau tradition was, as I've implied, sort of overrun or overridden by the editing-driven tradition. What happens is that the tableau tradition gets sort of made a minority option, while the editing-driven approach becomes dominant, as I've mentioned, with classical continuity cinema becoming a worldwide phenomenon, a kind of lingua franca of international filmmaking. But we can find the approach returning at various times in film history. And one of the most interesting examples, I think, happens with the emergence of widescreen filming in the 1950s, particularly in CinemaScope, where the conditions of filmmaking sort of call up again the idea that maybe tableau staging is still viable. What happens is that in early CinemaScope, a lot of filmmakers were told or believed that they couldn't cut very much and they couldn't come in very close to the characters. So we had to, because the scale of the frame, that people were seeing, a very, very big screen, meant that they would be overwhelmed by rapid cutting or big faces that would just seem distracting and maybe pull them out of the story. So the one recipe that was put forward was keep your camera back and don't cut a lot. Well, that's very close to the premises of the tableau system of the early cinema, of the teens that we've been looking at. Nevertheless, of course, filmmakers felt that they still had to have a dramatic development or flow to the scene. So what happens, I think, is that in early CinemaScope, filmmakers intuitively and spontaneously rediscover some of the principles we've been looking at with respect to tableau cinema. That is, the same kinds of constraints and technical considerations, like the optical projection that's inherent in cinema, become important for filmmakers in the early 1950s. And so they rediscover the principles we've been looking at. Now, I'm not saying they were influenced by early cinema. I'm not saying that filmmakers went into archives and watched some of these films from the teens. I'm saying that because of similar conditions that were enforced on them, they discovered the same kinds of visual principles, visual ideas. So, for instance, in this scene from Island in the Sun, we find many things that are quite familiar to us from looking at early cinema. In the first frame, James Mason and his wife are sort of huddling there. She's rather cold to him. But what happens is, in the background, we have a doorway, very familiar to us now from early film, where Joan Collins comes in. You can see her in the distance there. As James Mason's wife, in the second frame, comes closer to the camera diagonally, and you can see the camera tracks back a little bit to compensate for that, Joan Collins comes into the scene rather frontal, rather centered, and commands our attention as well. In the third frame, the wife is left already, and James Mason is left staring after her, but Joan Collins has crossed the frame and gone over to a mirror, no surprise, in the sort of center left of the frame, where we can see her face as she's primping there. James Mason is left staring off. And then while he's still trying to figure out the result of the quarrel with his wife, Joan Collins trots off into the background and goes out in the doorway that she came through initially. So we've had a single shot bit of action here played out with respect to the depth staging of the characters in relationship to one another, both in terms of the husband and wife, but also in terms of the stretching of the characters into the diagonal of the depth in the second frame. And we've had the same sort of use of mirrors and frontality that we've seen in early cinema. So again, I'm not saying there's an influence here, but directors of this period began to explore the possibility of sustaining scenes in long takes, with distant camera, through the more elaborate staging that we associate with a much early period of cinema, the tableau era. And in fact, you can say that this tableau staging returns in what's sometimes called Asian minimalism of the 1980s and 90s, where directors, not required to shoot in long takes, but decided as an aesthetic option to shoot in long takes, rediscovered some of these principles, such as having people turn from the camera so that we pay attention to the more frontal and centered figures, blocking and revealing those characters at certain moments in the dialogue, turning their heads even very slightly to create more information about facial expression and dramatic confrontation. So again, I'm not saying that someone like Ho Xiaoshen went back and studied films of this period, but that given certain aesthetic choices he made, then staging in this manner became a logical option. So I want to suggest that across the history of cinema, mainstream storytelling cinema anyway, we have two forms of cinematic construction that are available to filmmakers: the dominant tradition of continuity editing and a subordinate tradition of tableau staging. And of course, any given film can mix them together. I'm not saying that they only appear in pure form, but actually fairly pure, because popular cinema, with some exceptions, tends to continue the continuity tradition. It's editing driven and depends on all those principles that we've looked at. Whereas the tableau tradition is seen mostly in independent or festival-based cinema. And both started in the 1910s, that era where we can think that our cinema began. Thanks a lot. For more ideas and information, you can go to other places on the web, our general website, and the blog attached to that site. And thanks for watching and listening.